Welcome back to the Umucho podcast with Dydine and Alex, the podcast where we explore different cultures with people from all around the world. Today we're talking with Bernadett Vajda about her experiences with trauma. She is, unfortunately very, very familiar with that. So she shares her experiences and what we can all do to sort of get through that particular thing.
I like what she said about healing journey after experiencing tragedies, because she, you hear her story. It's an incredible story, but also we talked about our current situation. The loss of the death of George Floyd and every other Black person that been killed at the hands of police brutality. So this is an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And we hope we can inspire people through these, meaningful conversations.
Absolutely. And one thing that I think that a lot of people can get out of it is what we can all do to be allies and to spread the conversation and how we can have those difficult conversations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, guys, enjoy the episode.
So, Bernadett, you are, yes. God, you have experienced a lot in your lifetime, and you've seen a lot. You've been to so many countries. You've been an immigrant. You were born in Hungary. You moved to Israel. All these places that you went to. With our podcast, we like to share other people's cultures and other countries' cultures, and just find those little things that makes us all the same and unite us as human beings. Mm-hmm. And from your experience, we would love to hear from you, just telling us a little something on how you grew up and your upbringing and what made you, be you, who you are now, sweet, wonderful person.
Yeah, it's so complex as we've talked about before, but I was born in Budapest, Hungary. I have an older sister, and my parents, like every immigrant story, it's so complex. So I'm not going to get into the complexities of it because it's so like most immigrant stories. So I kind of give the abbreviated version because oftentimes if I'm talking to other immigrants, they're like, yeah, like they can identify with the story, but oftentimes I know that people kind of just get clouded over if they ask. Mm-hmm. So we went from Hungary to Israel. My dad left first to go to Israel, and my mom left separately with me and my sister. And I met my father when I was 2.5 or 3 years old in Israel. So I hadn't met him. So my mom was pregnant with me and he had left to go to Israel. Mm. And we didn't meet till then. And I lived in Haifa, Israel, and Hebrew is my second language. I don't speak fluently anymore, but I used to live in Israel and Hebrew. And then we moved to Brazil, and then in Rio de Janeiro. Then we moved to California, and then back to Brazil in Sao Paulo. And then we settled in Massachusetts and moved to Massachusetts because my dad's work, and started in the second grade, not speaking English and, having no friends. Mm. So, it's more complex, it's more detail oriented, and I could probably spend hours and days talking about that story. But, we came here with just the clothes on our back and a couple of pieces of furniture. Mm-hmm. And we had just come from Brazil. And as you know, Brazil is a warmer climate than the East Coast. And when we went to Massachusetts, we had no clothes. We didn't have anything. And the community gave to us. I grew up in a town called Andover, Massachusetts. And the community gave to us. We shopped at yard sales, at garage sales, and we never owned new clothing. It was always used and borrowed and given. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, going to a store like a JCPenney or something was like going to Gucci today, or what I mean? You're like, woo, yeah, like we're getting new clothes. Yeah. So So anyway, that's a little background.
Thank you.
Well, transitioning, what would you say is the most challenging moment in your life, and kind of what tools did you use to overcome or heal from whatever trauma you may have experienced?
Mm-hmm. Well, the word trauma, I know we're going to talk about it because I love talking about trauma and understanding it. But the more I know, the more I understand. Trauma affects so many areas. There's so many things that happen in everyday life that people don't categorize as trauma. So I've had traumatic events in my life, but the biggest trauma was the murder of my father. And this month marks 20 years that the verdict came in for the man who killed my dad. So, the tools, I don't know if I had tools, but what I've always said is that I think we are all born with everything we need. And it's our job to kind of like rip apart, excavate, like be like, what are those people who dig for dinosaur? What are they called? Archaeologists. But to really dig within to like find how to survive, because when trauma like that happens, when murder happens, as we're all experiencing it, I think America was awoken to murder, like really what murder looks like. For the first time, I think a lot of people are awaking, and I have friends who are like, I can't see that. I'm like, you watch crime movies, you watch Martin Scorsese movies with gunshots, people being killed. There were no guns. There was just a knee on a neck and someone being killed. Why can't you watch that? Why are we watching violent films? So I'm moving away from your question, but trauma and really going within. I was paralyzed emotionally when my dad died. The day after I found out about my dad, I went on a job interview. And if you look at what happens in a traumatic event, the fact that I went on a job interview is considered normal because you're in shock. So we do things. So there's different things that we go through in traumatic events. So everyone's like, you went on a job interview? And the man who I interviewed with, that was my first interview. I got called back 2 more times. So I performed at such a level that he thought I was a good enough candidate to come back 2 more times. I didn't end up getting that job. And when he found out who I was, he was like, holy shit. Sat in front of me and talked. And one of his questions was like, what's your biggest challenge? I was like, and this is just hours after my dad's murder. Yeah. So trauma, survivalship, going in our toolbox. I'm constantly digging through. I come from a family of survivors too. My dad was Jewish and my mom's Catholic, and my great aunt and uncle and relatives survived Auschwitz. They were in the concentration camps in Auschwitz. So I always think that in my mom's family survived the Hungarian Revolution. So it's so complex that some people are like, what's the Hungarian Revolution? Or, it's like, it's so much to talk about. Right. But I come from a family of survivors. And one of the things that I always thought when I would lay in bed, I called it sleeping wide awake, because I never slept the first few years. I slept with my eyes open. I don't know if you can imagine that, but it was like I was in bed, my physical body was in bed, but I was awake. For years. So I didn't sleep for a few years. I don't think I slept until I moved to New York. And that was 3 years after my dad's murder. And I was in such severe trauma when I moved to New York that my friends who've known me since I moved to New York, were like, you didn't appear that way. You didn't seem that way. You were fine. And my therapist was like, you couldn't put a sentence together. And I couldn't speak everything was fragmented. Sounds, trauma, like the sounds, people, what I thought were gunshots on the street, but it's like the car exhaust. It's like, Even last weekend, I'm in New York City. I heard gunshots over the weekend, and I messaged my neighbor my friend who lives across the street, and I was like, "Are those gunshots?" She goes, "I think so." She goes, "You're okay." And I said, "I know I'm okay, but like, what do you do? What do you do? Where do you run to?" Surviving is in my blood. It's in my desire. I say I don't know if I have the tools, but one thing I've always talked about is intuition. And my intuition, I think intuition is something that can be cultivated. People are like, "I'm not intuitive." We can all really hone in on our intuition, and it can really guide us. I've looked at my relatives to for survivalship, because I always think if they survived Auschwitz, the concentration camps, I can survive. I always thought that. I always thought I can really survive anything. There's two things I always say to my niece. I have a niece, and I always say to her, there's two things I can't do. I can never be a ballerina. I'm just not built like a ballerina. And I can never be president of the United States because I wasn't born in America. But other than that, I feel like I could do anything. And I've always had that feeling. And finding support after my dad died was also a challenge. There weren't like support. There were support groups, but it's now probably become more organized of an organization for survivors. But at the time, I was really digging for help and calling places for help. Like, how do I couldn't take a breath. It was so much trauma and pain in my body that I couldn't function.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious. I mean, how is it talking to other people about their anxiety and their trauma? Because you say you can go through anything, and you have this very strong belief through that. But do you find it easy to talk about these things with other people and to share that same sort of positivity and strength with those people?
I found, so when my dad was first murdered, I literally would go around and be like, "Hi, my dad was murdered." Like I was just FYI, this is what's happening. This is, and I had to learn through my own process, through my own digging, that only share your story with people who can hold your story, like really hold it. Some people, Brene Brown has this great term for the word trust, this acronym. It's called braving. I don't know if you've heard it. It's because I always had a thing with trust, issue with trust. Like people are like, "You don't trust." I was like, I trust, but there's only certain people we trust. So what does that really mean? So when I share my story, does the person have boundaries? If I share something, are they going to go and tell everyone else? Are they reliable? Are they accountable? There's all these things with Brene Brown's braving: boundary, reliability, accountability, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And I always think, in the beginning, I shared my story with so many people, and I felt as though I was a walking wound. I was just an open sore, and I had to close the sore and not give my goodness, my pain, my anything to anyone. I had to protect, and I had to heal. I had to like fill my own bucket. And I think, people talk about self-care, and I don't think self-care is going to get a facial. I mean, it's nice, but self-care for me is saying no. It's doing things for me. It's checking in with myself. And if my friends are like, "Why aren't you going out?" I'm like, "Because I don't want to." And being okay with saying no. My mom always says no is a complete answer. So
and to be comfortable with saying no. It can be hard to say no sometimes, and to be, and that'd be like the period, the finality.
It is. And, obviously to friends, sometimes you're like, "I'm not in the mood." It's not like, "No, bye." Like you don't talk to your loved ones like that. But I just meant it in that category. But since I've become more open, and it's been really hard. I haven't been open because when I moved to New York, I didn't want to be like the girl whose dad was murdered. Because when I go to my hometown, if someone sees me, I still hear the whisper. I heard the whispers when I would go in a coffee shop. I heard the whispers at the grocery store. "There's the girl whose dad was just murdered. There's there's the girl. There she is. There's the family. And it's like, you can't walk, because it was in the front page of every paper in Massachusetts. It was in the National Enquirer. It was a national news story.
Right.
Everyone was calling, the reporters, like every station, like right when they came to our house to tell us my dad was murdered that night, a reporter showed up at our porch. And I went to go open the porch, and they said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so from this paper." And I'll never forget, I closed the door on their face, and I shut the porch light out. And you don't know my mom, but my mom's a tough Hungarian woman. She goes, "Don't you dare do this to someone. Don't ever be rude." Like, she's like, "Don't be rude," even though that's how she speaks with an accent. But she's like, "Don't be rude." She's like, "They don't deserve that. They're doing their job." And that moment, everything changed. Everything changed. Everything. I mean, how we treat others. Here you are in your biggest life event, and you're being taught not to be rude. Most people would be like, "F off. Don't come here again," yada, yada. But my reaction, my reflex was, shut the light off. And like, I froze because everything was coming at me. And then that night, I literally called everyone I know, my family in Europe. I was like, "Hi, it's Bern. My dad was murdered." And I don't remember it until my friends told me that I did that. So that night, my reflex was, just tell everyone. Just you got to call everyone. So I called everyone I knew, like everyone I knew.
Well, when you say it changed everything, because I would be taken aback if my own mother said that to me. I'm like, I would feel like almost that she wasn't taking my feelings into account, and like I was to blame for being rude. I feel like, I mean, I can't speak for anybody and how they would take it, but that's just my gut reaction, I think. How did that change specifically? Like, how did that change things for you?
You know, my mom has a thing with, my mom she is a truth teller. She will tell you the truth. She's like, no, that's not how it happened. And you're like, "How did it happen?" And she has the memory of no one I know. She'll remember friends' parents from second grade when we moved to America and she didn't speak English, and she'll remember where they lived and da-da-da. And you're like, "How do you remember this?" My mom is a truth teller, and she strongly and believes and instilled in us that there's no excuse for poor behavior. There's no excuse. I don't care of anything, but you don't treat people like that. And, you know, at the time, I don't recall if I fought with her, but I said, "But Mom," I remember going like having an outburst. You know, it was such I'm thinking back to our home and everything, but it was, really, it doesn't matter, because the truth is, you know, I always say to people, like guy friends who are like, "I'm a gentleman." I was like, "You don't have to say you are. You just are. You just are."
Yeah, you don't have to explain yourself.
You don't have to explain yourself. So you just be who you are. And yes, of course, my mom challenges me, but that's the point. We are here to.
Yeah, and I believe people take trauma, they experience trauma differently. In that moment as a child, that's the way you were expressing your trauma. And for her, she had to be strong for both of you, and put aside her trauma in that moment. But it doesn't mean she wasn't experiencing as well. But my question on the trauma, we're like talking about trauma a lot, because especially what's going on now.
I love talking about trauma.
I know there's so much going on, and the world is really wounded, and most people don't even know that they need help, or they know they need help, but the help is not accessible. What do you think, from someone who experienced it and was able to get help and maybe still looking for help, what does trauma do to someone? And if you don't get help, how do you heal from those tragedies and like murderers and stuff, what's going on?
Well, I just wanted to touch a point because Alex asked about like talking to people, because the more I open up, the more people are share their stories with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I do a lot of talks at schools and about body image and confidence and how to overcome, intertwined with my business. And of course, pending on the audience. But some people, I have a friend who was raped, and talking to me, she goes, I didn't even know I had trauma until talking to you. Mm-hmm. I'm like, how do you and of course I have not of course, but I have a lot of friends who were raped and abused as children, just so many stories, and it's widespread across. My neighbors are moving upstairs, so I don't know if you can.
Oh yeah,
it's great. I love New York. But it's widespread. But the more I share and the more I open up, because I wasn't comfortable, because I didn't want people to look at me like that, that girl, or there she is talking about murder again. Yeah. And even now with George Floyd, some of my friends are calling and they're like, how are you? And obviously I'm not a Black woman or a Black man. I don't know the Black experience, but I know it from my friends, and I can only identify with it when I've had Black boyfriends and seen the racism that happens when I go into a restaurant that I've been in before by myself or with a girlfriend, and then go in with a Black man. I was like, oh wow, you're racist. I don't see, you know what I mean? We don't see it. So with everything that's going on, I think America is seeing trauma at levels with COVID and George Floyd. I mean, it's the levels of people seeking medicine, mood altering medication, and seeking therapy is at an all-time high. Mm-hmm. I mean, I am an outgoing person. I'm an extreme extrovert or an extrovert. I don't know. Someone called me an extreme extrovert, but I've been fine, quote unquote. I mean, I'm doing like everyone else, witnessing what we're all witnessing and experiencing. Right. I have tools now that I didn't have when my dad was killed. So now seeing all this, I also, I said to one of my friends that I don't know if the movement of George Floyd would be as big if we weren't in COVID, if we weren't forced to look at what happened.
Right, right. And we were talking about that earlier, is that, I mean, this, and we'll touch on this in a little bit, but because everybody is forced to stay inside, and so many people have been laid off of work, we have nothing else to do than, stare at our screens, watch TV, and listen to the news. So there are more eyeballs on this type of situation, than ever before. And again, not just because we're in the 21st century, but because of this pandemic. So it's no surprise that you hear about protests and all these people speaking up and speaking out about it publicly, and amongst family all over the world, because it is loud, and it's very, very loud.
Because of what's going on in the world, especially there was Hungarian Revolution, there's a Holocaust, there's a lot of atrocities happening all over the world. And there's a lot of wounds that are walking around in the world without being healed, because there's no enough access to medicine, access to therapists, access to, how you can work on yourself and, and heal from those wounds. When you hear a word trauma, as somebody who experienced it, what comes in your mind?
The first thing is not what comes to my mind, is what comes to my body. One of the practices that I learned to do was called psychodrama, and it was really a popular form of therapy in the 70s, and controversial, but now more people are doing it with just across the board with people who've experienced trauma. And in layman's term, it's you're in a group facilitated by a professional, and different people with different backgrounds, and you act out your trauma, or it could be something as small as you went and got your coffee and someone told you to move, you fat ass, Like, it could be something like that, which happens, all over the world, like move over, you ugly, or blah, blah, blah. And that's traumatic in your day. It's not traumatic, but it's aggressive.
Right.
So you get to act that out. And sometimes hearing, you grab different people in the group and you ask them to play the person who yelled at you, and you ask them to play the coffee person, and you play yourself, or you reverse roles, and you get to really play out and say things to people that you might not necessarily have. So with what you said with the Holocaust and the Hungarian Revolution, both my parents with their ancestors and like generations down had their trauma, and then my mom surviving what she did in Hungary and her family, and her story is so traumatic. Her family being kicked out of their home, and with everything that was happening with all the kids that Trump wanted to send back and separating families. My mom was so taken back because that's what happened to her family. That the government came to kick them out of their home.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I heard my mom even like talk. I mean, I know her story, but it was like the first time where she was just so upset with what was happening in America with those kids with trauma. So imagine two people coming together, having a family with their traumas. Of course, we know that trauma is generational, right? And we're all learning, everyone. It's like we're all learning collectively.
Right.
And what happens with trauma, when I think about it, or it's not a think, it's a feel. And what I learned in psychodrama is that we have to think about where we feel the pain. And for some people, it's in their neck, it's in their shoulder, it's in their mind, in their jaw. For me, it was always like I couldn't fucking breathe. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know how to take a full breath forever. And I felt like something was sitting on my, like everything was like that. And I couldn't breathe. I just couldn't breathe for years. And I had to learn how to take a breath.
Wow.
I couldn't, and I hate saying it with George Floyd, but it's my story. I couldn't physically take breaths because the trauma was so big, and trying to understand it. And even, we talked about so many things, but I didn't have the resources. I didn't grow up with money.
No.
I grew up in the suburbs of Massachusetts. There weren't like, not a lot of people were murdered in my town. I don't think. It was national news. It's like, so I had to dig and hunt, and like, people were like, well, there's a Spanish speaking support group. I was like, all right, I'll go. They're like, do you speak Spanish? I'm like, I know how to order like beer and tacos and swear a little bit. They're like, you can't go to a support group if you know a few words in Spanish. But I was in such dire needs to find a community to work with and to help me, because nothing made sense.
Right.
So it's like everything is wiped out, and you have to hold on to what you know, which is the truth, kindness. Don't slam the door on people, on reporters' faces. You got to stick to that. So I feel trauma in my chest for people, and then of course intellectually, I feel it where I know what they're going through. Like I feel families' pain. Like sometimes if trauma happens in the country, shootings, I can go down such a path with all those shootings, and I have to be careful because I can easily wind up re-traumatizing myself for a period of time.
Right.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can identify with that or if that makes any sense, but
It does
that's
make
what,
sense.
whenever there's a school shooting or just mass shootings, I have to be careful. That's part of my self-care.
Even now here, when there's any shooting or whatever the sounds we hear, we take cover and we remind ourselves, wait a minute, it's not, nobody's shooting at the house. But they're just a sound triggers something. So,
or like you said earlier, like if a car backfires, you don't really know if it's a gunshot or car backfiring or a firework, but it still kind of triggers that thing in you where you kind of have to take a moment. It's kind of like a fight or flight type deal.
Yeah.
Right. So imagine war veterans who came back who didn't talk about it, and they ended up on the street, drugged, whatever. They didn't want to talk about it. So one of the things, I always say, and I don't know, so don't quote me on this, but when I started knowing about trauma, they said that if you treat trauma, it can last up to 20 years. If it goes untreated, it can last a lifetime. And we see that with people. If, there's that book, The Body Remembers. Maybe I'm saying the title wrong, but our bodies, I was sick all the time after my dad was killed. And I haven't been sick, knock on wood, in years. Like I have maybe allergies, like right now. I'm a little stuffed up, but I haven't been sick. I was in so much trauma that I was sick all the time. All the time. The body is shut down. People who've experienced trauma, there's so much layer of pain. Yeah. And the only way to go through it is to talk and go to someone you trust. And just even talking to a friend, and they can open up a door. And when I moved to New York, I was a waitress and I didn't have money. And my therapist said, you can pay $25, and paid her $25. And sometimes I couldn't afford to pay. And, as the years progressed, I was able to, but for years I couldn't pay. And I think people always think that it costs money, but people are out there to help, and there's resources out there. And I wish I had prepared resources for people, but there's resources. Like even now in New York City, I'm sure in Los Angeles and California, you get text alerts and people with mental health lines, but there is help for trauma victims out there. And there are great therapists who will only say, give me $10 or $25 or free. And that's how I got here, through people who loved me and cared for me.
Right.
Wonderful. So Bern, or having been involved in politics, we read your resume. You're involved in politics in Massachusetts.
Massachusetts?
What are your thoughts on our current situation and the steps do you think people should take to ensure a positive change?
One thing I've learned, and I always say I started my political career when I was 14. I volunteered for a state senator. I've always loved politics. I've always loved service, the act of service. I've done so many different things, but just volunteering and being an intern at 14 at the State House in Massachusetts, I got to see and campaign and see what people were saying. And I would knock on doors and hand out pamphlets to senior centers of the senator that I was supporting. And you get to really hear and talk to people and hear the issues. And one thing, and I've always said this, and I don't care if people get mad, but I think Americans take their freedom for granted. And I don't know after this all, they will take their freedom for granted, but get involved in your community, talk to people, get out there. And people are like, I want to do something big. People want to be like Instagram famous or whatever. Right. Get involved in your grassroots organizations. There's so many great people. Like I live near a school and there's a sign out. They were giving free meals out. There are volunteers giving free meals out to like 1 in 4 kids in New York State or New York City are food. Like they don't have food. They don't have food. And that's, get involved in the school. All you got to do is show up and be like, hey, I want to volunteer. They're like, okay, just sign up this. It's that easy to change someone's life. Those people all changed my life when I came to America. People gave us stuff. And here I am all these years later saying, either still friends with them, those people who helped our family, or talking about them and paying it forward. Get involved in your communities and vote. I know everyone says, oh, vote, but getting involved in grassroots is always been my go-to. If there's nothing, there's 2 kinds of tithing. There's financial and there's service, or maybe there's more, but that's always been my go-to is.
Right. Yeah. And it's, doing as much research as we can. And like you said earlier, we are all constantly learning and not everybody knows everything about everything. And especially now when we're sharing our opinions, and again, we are loud. It's almost like everybody now has like a megaphone, and everything they say is just projected louder. But you know, it can be kind of dangerous if you don't do research. But I mean, going back to what you just said a moment ago about, you know, changing things on like a micro level, a lot of times, and I can attest to this as well. I mean, going back to like the elections throughout like 2012 and 2016, you think that, you know, if you vote then that's the one that's going to make the biggest difference. When in actuality, like, that is very important, yes, but you can't forget about voting whenever you can on a micro level.
Attorney General, people who are prosecuting, people are all, you know, Governor Cuomo, he has this great thing. He always says every day at the press conference, he says, I'm going to start with the facts. These are the facts, and then I'll tell you my opinion. So he's like, I don't care about people's opinions. Everyone's got an opinion about everything.
Sure.
Everyone.
Right.
I'm a small business owner. I want to be working. I want the stores open. I want this. But the facts are this and this and this. He says, when you go and ask for something, be so specific with your request. You know, there's a thing with women. I don't know if you guys get this, but people are like, if you're single, write down everything you want in a man, you know, and then be very specific in what you want. And people, like, some girlfriends are like, I did that and I met my guy, and I'm like, oh, I hate those girls. No, I'm just kidding. But it's really being specific, because there are laws. You know, one of the things that I have been talking about for 20 years, you know, when my father was killed, all the evidence goes to the grand jury, and they come back and say, you have enough evidence here to convict him of first-degree murder. And the man who defended him is also the man who defended Whitey Bulger. You know Whitey Bulger? He's the second most wanted man in the world. Next to Osama bin Laden, it was Whitey Bulger. Mm-hmm. Wow. So the man who killed my dad had the means to hire the best attorney, and one of the best in America. Mm-hmm. And my family didn't have money. I mean, usually the state prosecutes, but if you have money, you're going to hire someone. My family doesn't have and didn't have those resources. Now today, I probably would have started a GoFundMe page. I would have done everything to help my family. The storyline may have been different, but one of the reasons that, you know, Cuomo says to be specific is because the prosecutor, I think, did a bad job, and the defense team did a great job. He was the NFL and the state was a high school coach. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. High school coach can't go up against the NFL. You know, you just can't. They're two different leagues. Right. They're two different people. Right. So we had the high school coach and he had the NFL coach, and the jury came back with voluntary manslaughter. And when the sentencing came back 20 years ago, this month, the judge, who was named one of the top worst judges in America, and because the state of Massachusetts allows the judge on voluntary manslaughter to give the sentence whatever he wants, he could have given him 5 months in prison to 20 years. He gave him 5 to 8 years, and he only served less than 5 for murder. Right. And there are people in prison. This is why it's not just what we're talking about today, but there are people in prison who are there for, you know, everyone's like, oh, George Floyd, the $20. One of the things I get pissed about is that people are blaming the victim. Right. I don't want to hear anything about George Floyd. He didn't do shit. Mm-mm. He's innocent in all of this. Right. So that, you know, to me, getting involved in your community and knowing the laws is on your side. People are not, you know, everyone says, my sister called me. My sister lives in Italy. Mm-hmm. And she said, what do you think is going to make everyone feel better? And I said, justice. I go, they all need to be arrested. Like yesterday. That's, you know, and everyone thinks, okay, they're arrested now, great. Well, it's not over. No, because the laws, I don't know the laws in Minnesota, but people have to be careful, because if there's too much media coverage, which there is, the world is watching, then they might move the case to another town where the people look different than in that community.
Right.
So there's so many legal terms that I don't know all the law. I don't know laws. I wish I knew more about it, but I'm still constantly learning.
Right.
But the injustice is so big and it's so ingrained. And that's why I've had enough of that shit.
Right.
I've had enough of bullshit.
And again,
of like,
it's loud and everybody sees it.
Well, I pray that people take action, because it's not just like, okay, this is happening and then it goes away in 6 months when we're all back to our new normal. And the reality is that may happen. It may go back to that, and some people will jump on the wagon and some people will fall off. And we got to keep helping those people who want to come on the wagon. We got to reach our hand out and help those people on the wagon and say, thank you, thank you. And everyone's talking about the diversity in these protests. It's not just Black people. I see a ton of Asians. I see white people. I see Hispanics. It's like everyone is in it. The world is marching. Like Ireland.
Yeah.
I've been to Ireland. I didn't see a lot of Black people.
No, I've been there too.
You know what I
like
mean?
3
Like
Black people.
in Hungary. Okay, no one's protesting in Hungary, but I don't think they are. But it's a very small country. But people are protesting all over the world, and it is.
Yeah. But I mean, you're absolutely right, because I mean, you look at the last 5-6 years. I mean, you look at with Colin Kaepernick, that whole thing, you know, what he stood for, and then the backlash that he got. It has historically been something that, like you said, it goes on strong for a month and then there's fall off. I mean, in order to continuously make change, a big part of it has to be consistent pressure on changing, not only, you know, having justice and arresting these people who need to be arrested, but to keep on pushing the change of policies, changing this systematic thing that has historically been oppressing people of color.
And for people to unlearn what they have been learning for so long, I feel like racism is just not in the system. It's also ingrained in people's hearts and home. The conversations you're having with your children, what your grandparents your parents are telling your children. You know, just like all the schools in the school system, like so they just supporting being able to have those tough conversations and protest every single day. You don't protesting does not mean you're going in the street. Yes, go in the street, but also if someone in your family says something that you don't agree with, speak up. And you know, if Black people don't have to be there to witness that you spoke up for them, because all of this really affects all of us.
Right.
It affects whites, it affects Asian, Indian, everyone. Whatever we do in justice to another human, it's affecting everyone on earth at the same time.
I feel like that's so true. I see that there are people being weeded out now. There's this girl trending on Instagram who got on like TikTok to cry about the racism that her parents taught her, and just, you know, there's just like I'm starting to see these young kids, these young white girls who are like, oh no, my parents are racist and this and this and this. And you're right, people are, I mean, we all know that it's taught. And when my family moved to America, you know, we lived in Brazil, we lived everywhere. My dad was Jewish. Like when I told people that I was half Jewish, they never said, oh, you're Catholic. They would always stop and go, oh, I didn't know you were Jewish. Mm-hmm. Oh, we celebrate Shabbat on Friday nights. We have Shabbat dinner. And they're like, you're Jewish? It was never, oh, you're Catholic? It was like, oh, I didn't know you were Jewish.
Right.
It's always like, oh. And I didn't really know what that meant when I was, and then when I dated, my first boyfriend was from Nigeria. And I remember telling my friends that I'm dating someone. They're like, do your parents know? And I said, do they know I'm dating? I'm like, yeah. And I was 19 years old. And they said, do they know he's Black? And I said, I don't know if I mentioned it. And I was like, what? Like, what do I need? Like, what? Like, what? I didn't know.
Right. Yeah.
And I like, Mom, I'm dating a black guy. She goes, so? She goes, I dated an Egyptian in Hungary. So it was like in Hungary, like the racism was towards other cultures, right? The non-whites, whoever was not white in Hungary. Because if you go to Hungary, there's not a lot of black people. Like I never see, like it's a white country. It's like white and Jewish and Catholic. It's like, so for me, when I told my mom, she's like, okay. She didn't flinch. It was my friends that I grew up with who had said things to me, and I didn't know what that. I was like, so what?
They have, those
but I didn't grow up with that. I didn't grow up with my parents saying anything like that, because we had all kinds of people in our home and living around the world, and my mom just wasn't raised like that. Right. My dad wasn't raised like that. Maybe, my dad, I didn't have 100 years with him, but, being a survivor of the Holocaust, as a child of a survivor, he had his traumas too. And I don't think he ever fully cleared that or worked through that, because he died so young. So I don't think he ever worked through the traumas. Right. I mean, I know he didn't. I don't think, let me rephrase myself. He didn't. He never worked through his traumas.
Like Dydine had just said, it's not necessarily the responsibility of people of color to speak out to white people about these things. Like, it's important that they know, but it's one thing for a black person to talk to a white person about racism and about systematic oppression and this, that, and the other. But it's a totally thing entirely for a white person to take it upon themselves to have that conversation in private. Because, I've never been, I can't say, because I grew up in the suburbs in Dallas, so I was around white people my entire childhood. So I kind of saw a little bit of both. But I don't think I've ever been, I can't recall a situation where I was ever around a white family where we ever had a discussion about race. And I'm saying if we did, they were always acutely, and of course they were acutely aware that I was present, right? So, but those conversations when I'm not there, when nobody else of color is there, those conversations are important. Those are the conversations that need to be had, and to have a deep understanding, because obviously they're learning as well. Everybody is still learning, so we were doing research, and we ran across this woman, Robyn D'angelo. I'm not sure if you've heard of her. She speaks about white fragility and why it's so difficult to talk. And she's a white woman. She talks about why it's so difficult to talk to white people about race. And some of her bigger points was this.
What's her name? Robyn? What's her name? Robyn what?
Robyn D'angelo.
Okay.
Right. So a lot of her big points is it is so ingrained in a lot of people's minds to be defensive. Like if a black person talks to a white person about race, one of the quickest things that a lot of white people do is jump to defense and be like, I'm not racist. Like, I'm not accusing you of being racist. I just want to kind of get this dialogue going. But it's so, there's a lot of times they're very, very quick. And particularly in my experience in Texas, very quick to assure me that, no, you're safe. I'm not like them. Or, I'm not responsible for whatever. Like, that's not what's important here. So my question to you, after that short ramble, is in your opinion, what can white people do? What can people who are not oppressed do? And what are the conversations what are the conversations they can have to better their understanding? And how would you go about doing that?
Shut up and listen. What people are doing is talking about their trauma. They're talking about their trauma. I if I look at just my experience with trauma, with what I went through, my experience, I like the fact that I felt like I couldn't breathe for so many years. I can't imagine, because I know what I went through, and it was it was excruciating pain to think that Black men go through what they go through when they leave the door of their home and are constantly having to prove something. I don't know that pain, but the trauma that's associated with that all the time, I have like, even though I've had trauma, it's still like a small portion of what they must feel like their whole life. Their whole, like, I have friends who tell me these stories, right? Not just now, because I've had these conversations and, you know, I like talking about this stuff. I want to talk, but, you know, my advice to people is always to listen to other people, hear what they want to ask you. Right. Sometimes it's just to vent. Sometimes it's, you know, someone, you know, I remember someone calling me a communist and a whore, and I didn't know what those things were. I know it was 8th grade, but still, I didn't know. Like, I mean, I knew what communism was, but I didn't know what a whore. And imagine being called names all the time, your whole life. I can't imagine that because I haven't been called a name my whole life. Right. I've been called things in New York City, you know, when I moved here, but it's different. But with trauma, with like systematic racism, it's like, so you're right. It's, people want to defend. They always want to jump and they want to do this. Just shut up. Everyone just shut. You know, you said before that everyone's has their opinion and there's on a megaphone. My grandfather, my mom's dad had a great saying, just because you have an opinion or a thought doesn't mean you have to share it. Everyone has to share everything. Yeah. Just listen. That's it. Just listen to people. Just listen to your friends. Don't like jump to things. You don't know the experience. Like I said, I don't know your experience. I don't know your experience. I know my experience, and I can empathize with trauma and the feeling and the hurt and someone who's been murdered. You know, I know that feeling. I know it so well. I can reenact the day that we found out about my dad's murder. I can tell you who was in the room. I can't tell you what I was wearing, but I can tell you the positioning of everyone. I can tell you what happened. I can tell you what the cops said in the courtroom afterwards. I can tell you shit like it was yesterday. I can tell you from my experience. And, you know, the other thing is that not everyone can hold your story. Who we talk to, it's like we got to find our allies. We got to find our people that we can pull up on the wagon, because there are people who are going to fall off the wagon. They're going to be like, oh, this is cool, it's trending. But there will be people, that's okay. That's okay. Right. There's a lot more people that have jumped on. There are so many more allies than you know. We see the heart of America. We are seeing what is, we see the heart. Look at what's happening in the world. That's what I share. I say, like, listen to, and I've been hearing my friends this week. She said something, she's a Black woman, and she said, you changed my opinion about something by sharing your trauma. And she's had an image of something within her community. And I said, just imagine what that's like, and just taking, and the conversation is fluid between friends. Right. We can all teach each other. But the point is to listen. Yeah, absolutely. I think listen. I think, but so I do want to look up this Robyn D'angelo, because I don't know. I don't know all of Black history, and yes, did I learn it in school? But I don't know. How would I know? My story is the revolution, is the Holocaust.
Yeah, and you know, in learning it in history class.
But I do.
That's I mean, I have my own feelings about that, because you don't learn. I learned more about Black history, thankfully, through my dad, and kind of learning through his experiences, my grandfather, my mother, and what I learned. You know, 90% of it wasn't in the history books. You know what I mean? I didn't learn about the Tulsa massacre in Oklahoma. I didn't learn about exactly kind of what was going on from the Black perspective. You know, I mean, those are all things that I had to personally learn through my own education. So, I mean, imagine if that's coming from a Black person, like if I'm from a Black family, and if I had to learn that through through my family, through my own family, I can only imagine what these plenty of other ethnicities, other races are learning. You know, they don't have that well of knowledge. So how do they learn? How do they have that conversation?
Well, imagine now today, there's what do they call trigger warnings on books? Like kids are told they might not want to read it because it's too much. Well, welcome to your world. Welcome to life.
Right.
Welcome to
Welcome to reality.
Welcome to
It's a big. The whole thing is a big active learning experience.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, and I understand sugarcoating certain things, certain historical facts for kids, obviously, but when you just omit like very crucial pieces of history to form a narrative, and I'm not sure if it's just to protect children and their own imagination, or if it's just because they don't consider certain aspects of history to be important, but it's dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous to not teach these kids about what's going on or what has come,
where the country comes from, because you can't really I myself, I believe that if you don't know how fragile your foundation is, you would just keep doing whatever you're doing on the top, and at some point the top is gonna collapse. And how do you go back and dig deep in the history of your own history and not fix it, figure out how to fix I don't even know how. Figure out
how to learn to live with it and incorporate it into your life. Because one of the things, I'm sorry to interrupt, one of the things that everyone wants to get rid of is anxiety. I have anxiety. I have to take medication. I have anxiety. I learned through psychodrama that anxiety is like the best thing for me. When I get anxiety, I'm like, it's coming up. It doesn't feel good. Doesn't always feel good. No. And I want it gone sometimes, but I'm like, oh, it's coming up for a reason. Oh, right. It's a warning. Right. It's a warning for me. And everyone, my parents used to say that like culture is always like to get ice cream and make it better. Like growing up, people would be like, get some ice cream. We'll talk about it over ice cream. And that's a Band-Aid. My parents always said that's a Band-Aid. Like you're not getting ice cream. We sit down, we talk about it. That was like my family, like forced to sit down. When everything happened with my dad, my mom was like, you girls are going to sit down. I have two sisters, one older, one younger. We're going to sit down. We're not going to criticize each other. We're not going to say who's running away from stuff or anything like that. We're going to go through his stuff. We're going to talk. My older sister ran upstairs and didn't want to do anything. And I go, why does she get to walk away? She goes, don't worry about what your sister's doing. Worry about what you're doing. And my mom is always like, in the midst of trauma, chaos, these lessons are my lessons today. Don't worry about what other people are doing.
Right. Worry about what you're doing.
Worry about what you're doing. She's like, don't. She's like, she ran away. So when we're talking about all people coming on board, not everyone. Let's not worry about those people who aren't coming on board. They'll eventually catch up. They'll eventually come, and maybe they won't.
But that's
maybe
okay.
They won't. And that's anxiety. The layer upon layer. I've learned to peel back the layers and the anxiety. I'm like, where are we going today? Like I have two things on my shoulders and I'm like, oh, cool. Like I have anxiety. Why do I have anxiety about this? I got to step back. It's a gift. My anxiety is a gift and people want to get rid of it. Yes, I had such anxiety that I couldn't leave. I used to sleep in the other bedroom. Now it's a closet, but I couldn't leave my bedroom. I would be paralyzed and not sleep. And it was unbelievable. The pain. I can bring myself back to it if I ever want to. I can feel it. But it's a gift to have anxiety because it's such a gift to see what's coming up for you.
That is fascinating. I've never heard.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard
someone embracing anxiety.
No. I think I've only ever heard, how do you get rid of anxiety? Everybody feels anxiety to varying degrees, right? But to look at it as a sort of like a guiding point or like an indication like, okay, maybe you should focus on this instead of just shoving it away in a closet. Because like it kind of goes with like the trauma thing. Like you try to shove trauma away and not deal with it, it is only going to come back. It's going to fester and set its own foundation in how you live your own life. But 20, 30 years down the line, something may happen that makes you snap. And then you're like, where on earth did that come from?
Yeah.
And that is, I think that is that's a crazy concept that is blowing my mind right now.
You know us redheads, we're full of knowledge.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, I always have to get the redheaded thing, and if my friends hear this podcast, they're like, "Here she goes with her redheaded thing." But that's the thing, though. With psychodrama, what I learned was when you talk it out, when you talk it through, it comes to you, and you have these moments. You're like, "Oh, I can." You know, you were saying about like the layer upon layer. We gotta like one of the reasons I survived because I thought about my great aunt who survived Auschwitz.
Right.
Everyone's like, "How are you doing during COVID?" I was like, "I got Netflix, I got food, I got a shower, I gained a shit ton of weight." I'm like, I'm fine. I mean, I'm fine, quote unquote. Like I'm like everyone else, but people have it worse.
Yeah.
People have it worse. There are people who have it worse. So to me, I look at all of it as we constantly have to be digging. And I just said to a friend the other day, I was like, sometimes, some years, I'm like, God, I don't want to learn anything this year. Can you just leave me alone? Can you just like let me be?
Yeah.
And then he's like, I'm like, but here we are, all of us being forced to look, and some will look away because it's too much for them, but they'll watch violence on TV and in the movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's also what we allow ourselves to think about, because everyone wants a break, but what do you want to break from? You just want to break from what you're allowing yourself to think about. If I think about my great aunt always told a story when she was in the camps. She said she got up before the others and tried to put herself together. She was in Auschwitz and she wanted to put herself together. And when I would go visit her in Salzburg, she ended up living in Salzburg after the war and everything. She every day would do her hair and put her lipstick on and just took care of herself. And she did the same thing in the camps. She did the same thing during the Holocaust. She would get herself ready.
Yeah.
Like what? Why? And people now are living in the COVID era, and they're not showering and they're not taking care of themselves. Why? Like everyone's got their why. And why did my great aunt do that? Why did she tell me these stories?
Right.
Like why? I think because I'm here to share. It was part of my survivorship too, like using her strength, using my family's strength, because when we dig in and we're like, hearing stories like Alex, you hearing about your father's stories and things that you never heard in the books. What's going to happen with the history books in 50 years from what we are living through?
Right. Right.
So what's your message to humanity as a whole?
Drink more water.
Amen.
I meant that.
Yep.
We all drink some water.
I was raised with a very powerful, strong woman who would not. She would never say those things, but doing the right thing will never. It can only press everything forward. It can only move things forward, and it's there. I am full of hope. I've always seen the light outside of it. Even though when I'm in the middle of it, I might not see it, but I strongly and truly believe that there are so many good people out there, and there's so many people doing great things, and really getting involved in your community, like really, like you don't even know what's going to happen at grassroots level. Like volunteer at the school, volunteer at your local organization. Like if you're into painting, go paint with kids somewhere, or like the elderly. You think it's nothing, but it's everything. Imagine how you're feeling during COVID and the isolation. Imagine elderly people in nursing homes. like what you can do for them. I mean, I'm not going to nursing homes right now. No one's going to nursing homes, obviously, but it's just the community, the micro level that we talked about earlier of getting involved with people. And I think people are also realizing that they were busy it was false. It was false busyness. And now that we've all slowed down, we realize what's really important. Like, people don't want to lose their family dinners. They don't want to lose their connections and meaningful conversations.
I would say, I mean, I like to always say, let's love be louder than hate. But I feel like in this quarantine, this other pandemic that's going on right now, I feel like people are realizing how important to shout out their love, because hate is never shy, and when people have so much hatred, they tend to express it as quickly as possible and as loud as possible. So with all those people out there with love and compassion and kindness, just let it out, literally. Let it be so loud that hatred will go down without us even noticing that it's there.
Good. Good.
I know.
It's a combination of both of yours. It's live your life with love and give yourself to those in need. Pause and really think about not just what you need, but we have the energy and the capacity to give our talents and just be there for somebody. And we all know people who are struggling. But I mean, and I can attest to this too. I mean, we can all be a little selfish, and it's a journey for me to get out of my own way and to share what I have to share, and my own strengths with people, share my weaknesses with people, just be with people and love them.
That's something I have been working on, is being able to share. I so can identify with you're right. It's like selfishness. It's like asking God, like, don't teach me anything this year. I'm like, who am I to tell anyone? Like whatever's going to happen is going to happen. It's how I'm going to react to the situation. Right. But you're so right about stepping out of our way and helping others to, because everyone needs help right now, like always, but everyone. You're so right. But one of the things, one of the things I've been working on is really using my voice, because I think I muted myself for a very long time. Because one of the things I told our mutual friend Console is that I'm working on something about the 20-year anniversary of the verdict. And I was like, oh, if I post it during this time, is it going to look like she's like piggybacking? And I'm like, no, I would have posted it. I mean, it's my story. It's 20 years. It's like, it's mine. It's not part of the movement, but it's injustice. There's a story to be told about injustice. And if it's happening
and it's important
in my community, meaning the community where someone can hire such a lawyer and my family couldn't hire such a lawyer. Imagine what's happening in communities where people don't have any income, like the injustice, the laws. I mean, it's so deep that I always think when my mom says you're angry, I'm like, no, I'm passionate. I'm correct. And I'm passionate.
I like that.
I am passionate. Yes. I'm passionate. I want what's right for people. And I don't think everyone should be convicted along the same lines, obviously. And it's like first-time offenders and things like that. But there is such injustice, and it is so messed up. It is so twisted. And I hope people are finally seeing it.
I hope so too. Yeah.
I'm really lucky I got to have this opportunity to speak with both of you, because I love what you said about not going out to protest, but this is your protest. This is your version of speaking out. And it's such a beautiful gift. To me already, I'm like, there's so much that's come up for me that, I've thought about, and just, stories and just the discussion. It's been eye-opening even for me. And really, I need to practice more of telling my story because I think like all these communities joining forces, because everyone's like, well, we've been talking about this, like the Black community is like, we've been telling you all, and now you're seeing it, now you're coming up. Like, what happened, with the LA riots? What happened with, everyone who's been murdered, like for wearing a freaking hoodie or for anything. And it's like, I want all these communities to come together, but it's going to take time and communication and listening.
Yes.
And really listening. Active listening.
Active listening. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned as much as we did. This was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Absolutely.
I loved Bernadett.
Yeah, she's such a good person. She's so funny. She's very quick, very quick-witted. Yeah, especially like with what she's been through. It's always refreshing to see someone with such light and such energy, and and share that positivity in a meaningful way.
It's a great testament that we can all get to that point. No matter what we went through, really we have a choice of what we can do next. Yeah.
Please check out our next episode and subscribe to all of our social media platforms. Subscribe to Apple Podcasts and everywhere else we have our podcast uploaded to. And also, we do have these episodes after we upload them on Apple Podcasts. They go up on YouTube afterwards. So if you don't have access to those podcast platforms, just head over to YouTube and you can find us there.
Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces, we have YouTube conversations with just both of us.
Yeah.
And they're fun. And that's the place where actually you can ask questions and we'll, respond right away.
And guys, we're actually really excited to announce our IMU campaign.
It's deep, Our IMU, we have teas in the store right now, and we want to spark meaningful conversations between strangers, which is really amazing. Every time I wear this t-shirt, people ask me, they look at it, oh, IMU. It's kind of like, it gives that sense of positivity in the heart of whoever that sees you.
And it asks the question, like, what does that mean? I am you. Well, if you look at it, I mean, it's literally what it is. Like, I am you, you are me. And it's kind of, what we talk about.
Same.
Right. It's what we talk about on this podcast is that we are all the same.
Let's not keep hurting each other.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, guys, stay tuned to the next episode.
Stay tuned.